The sound of heels on gravel shouldn't have felt like a threat, but when I heard them slicing through the silence that first morning, something inside me tightened. I had only been here 30 minutes, just long enough to brew a cup of coffee, and finally, after nearly 2 decades of building my life from scratch, exhale in the peace I thought I'd earned. That silence so complete, so perfect it had felt sacred. A kind of stillness city life never allowed. But those sharp, purposeful footsteps were a warning. Peace doesn't last. She came out of nowhere, dressed like a courtroom had spilled her onto the first floor, tailored navy blazer, leather-bound folder in one hand, and a scowl in the other. She didn't knock, didn't introduce herself. Just stood at the edge of my dock like she owned it, like I was the one trespassing. Her eyes scanned the cabin, the waterline, my deck chair, as if calculating the price of everything and the worth of nothing. I'm Laura Kent, president of the Willow Lake HOA, she said. Her voice was smooth, professional, but the kind that makes you clench your jaw without knowing why. We need to talk about this land, that land, my land. 18 years of 18-hour days. Countless boardrooms, 3 near bankruptcies, and a sleep schedule that would shame a surgeon. It had all led here, to this lakeside cabin, this hidden jewel. My realtor swore had a soul, and I believed her. That first sunrise melted across the lake like it was welcoming me home. I was done with the noise, the clang, the endless digital pulse of city living. I didn't move here to fight anyone, but Laura didn't give me a choice. The shoreline, she said, pointing at a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been sketched by a child. Crooked lines and smudged markers. It's community property, always has been. The previous owner understood that. I studied her carefully then because something was off. The way she said previous owner, like the name caught in her throat. Charles Walker, I said slowly, watching for a flicker. It came. Her eyes twitched. There was an understanding, she said, her voice colder now. Walker and I had an agreement. He knew how things worked round here. I laid out the official deed. The red seal glinted under the morning light like a badge of truth. My surveyor's map backed up every inch of land to the waterline. Mine. I could have thrown it all in her face, screamed that she had no right, but instead, I spoke calmly, evenly, hoping reason might still have a seat at her table. She didn't even glance at the documents. This isn't how we do things here, she said. And her tone shifted like I was no longer a neighbor, but an obstacle. You'll learn the rules, Mr. Reed. She left the same way she came, like a storm in heels. The next morning, I found the first violation notice stuck to my door. My red doormat, cheerful thing, meant to welcome, was deemed an approved color per HOA guidelines. $50 fine, payable in 10 days. Day 2, my grass had grown half an inch to high overnight. $75 fine. Day 3, wind chimes soft, barely audible were now noise pollution. $100 fine. I laughed at first, thought it was petty, maybe even absurd, but that laughter died fast, because it didn't stop. Every morning, another citation. My mailbox was non-standard, my porch light too bright, my recycling bin visible from the street. Each a fence pile onto the next like bricks in a wall meant to box me in, shut me up, and push me out. But I didn't break. I documented everything, photographed, time-stamped, categorized. If Laura wanted war, she'd pick the wrong veteran. I'd build a tech company from nothing. I knew how to debug chaos. And Laura Kent was a bug in the system. Then I met Tim Doddan, older man, kind eyes, jittery hands. He tended his garden like it was a confession. Quick glances over the shoulder, movements small and nervous. Charles Walker had problems with her too. He whispered one afternoon. But he left her something, a surprise, Tim added, eyes flicking toward my cabin. Said it would teach her about consequences. That night, I sat alone with my coffee gone cold, staring at Walker's old blueprints, newspaper clippings, bits and pieces of a man who had mastered irony the way architects master angles, traps, build into buildings, fountains that soak liars, parking lots that expose thieves, Walker didn't sell me a cabin. He handed me a stage. And Laura Kent, she was walking straight into the spotlight. What do you do when you realize your peaceful dream home is really someone else's battlefield? I sat on the edge of my deck, watching a heron glide silently over the lake. Its wings barely stirring the air. It should have felt peaceful, but peace had been contaminated by clipped notices taped to my door, by silent board members who stared just a little too long, and by Laura Kent's promises that felt more like threats dressed in a Sunday smile. The lake was calm. My mind was not. The violation notices were multiplying. I couldn't walk to my mailbox without wondering what would be waiting inside another absurd fine. Another accusation. Your porch furniture violates community guidelines for rustic consistency. $200. Your satellite dish is improperly mounted. $350. Excessive use of solar lights. $75. That one made me laugh. Until it didn't, but every fine came with more than just a dollar amount. It came with the message, "You don't belong here." And I knew I wasn't the first to feel it. That's when I got serious. I set up a full monitoring system, motion-activated cameras, GPS-tag photo logs, and time-stamped daily journals. Not out of paranoia, out of necessity. I wasn't just documenting property, I was documenting abuse. Because someone needed to expose how far Laura was willing to go and how many rules she was willing to break to make me surrender this land. But I wasn't backing down. I started walking the neighborhood with a camera, just as carefully as she had walked my shoreline that first day. And what I found made my jaw clench. Laura's own property was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. A large, unauthorized deck extension, fencing that violated height regulations, a barking dog off-leash, and the cherry on top, a massive political sign on her front lawn that violated multiple clauses in the HOA's signage policy. I took photos, annotated them, cross-referenced them with the HOA bylaws. This wasn't about rules. This was about control, and somewhere, Charles Walker was laughing. It was Tim, quiet, nervous Tim, who finally gave me the clue I needed. We were both pretending to admire his roses when he leaned in and whispered. Walker said this cabin would reveal her true self. He called it his masterpiece. That word chilled me. Masterpiece. Not escape, not retirement. A masterpiece. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a carefully laid trap. A calculated final act from a man who had spent his life using architecture to reveal character. But what exactly had he built into it? That night, I opened every cabinet, every panel, and every floorboard Walker had touched. I mapped wearing paths, checked crawl spaces, and found one strange vent behind a shelf just wide enough to fit a camera lens. A cold trickle of suspicion ran down my spine. He'd been watching someone, Laura, or someone else. The next morning, I found a certified letter jammed into my mailbox like it had been shoved in haste. I opened it slowly. It was a summons and official notice to appear before the HOA board for a disciplinary hearing. Signed by Laura Kent. The location, her house. Her house. The arrogance was astonishing. A private tribunal in her own dining room. She wasn't even pretending this was about fairness anymore. But fine. If she wanted a performance, I'd give her one. I wore a charcoal gray suit, professional, unshakable. I carried a black briefcase filled with legal documents, photos, GPS, logs, and a voice recorder I didn't intend to hide. When I walked into Laura's dining room, it looked like a courtroom had been sketched by a suburban dictator. Laura sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 board members who looked like they'd been dragged there against their will. The tension in the room was thick, tight smiles, twitching fingers, eyes that wouldn't meet mine. This was meant to intimidate me. It didn't. I'll be recording this meeting, I said, setting the recorder gently on a table, as permitted, under HOA Rule 4.7. The silence that followed was pure satisfaction. Laura tried to object something about privacy, decorum, community values, but I quoted the rule word for word, and her voice faltered. Her board members suddenly looked less like allies and more like hostages, and I hadn't even opened my briefcase yet. What followed was an ambush of absurdities. Violation summaries were read aloud with theatrical disdain. My porch lights weren't rustic. My mailbox didn't harmonize with the visual tone of the neighborhood. My doormat still hadn't been replaced. But then they escalated. The board voted to fine me $1,500 with an additional $100 per day penalty until I complied. Then Laura said it. If Mr. Reed does not comply within 30 days, we will place a lien on his property. A lien for a doormat. My blood went cold. She wasn't trying to find me. She was trying to take my home. I stood slowly, locking eyes with each board member. This is no longer a disagreement. This is documented abuse of power, and every word of this meeting has been recorded. My attorney will be in touch. I watched the fear ripple through them. The cracks in their unity began to show. One member man named Ron shifted uneasily. Laura. Maybe a lien is excessive for a doormat, Laura's. Claire cut him in half. The decision is final, but the decision wasn't hers anymore. I was done reacting. It was time to go on the offensive. I hired Clara Stone. She came highly recommended for one specific reason. She specialized in destroying corrupt HOA letters. When I walked into her office, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered a strategy. This isn't about aesthetics, she said, flipping through my documentation with raised eyebrows. This is about money. And she was right. 3 days later, after combing through county permits and zoning maps, I found it. Kemp Brothers Construction fell under that name were rejected permit applications for a luxury resort development right on the lakeside. There was only one problem with the proposed plans. The access road ran directly through my land, and that was the missing piece. Laura didn't want my property to protect the community. She wanted it to line her brother's pockets. That night, I stared out at the moonlit lake, the water smooth as glass, and felt a switch flip inside me. This wasn't personal anymore. It was war. And I wasn't fighting it alone. Claire found the next bombshell. A conservation easement filed by Charles Walker 8 years earlier, ironclad, permanent, and federally protected. It prevented any development whatsoever on my land. Violations carried $10,000 per day fines. The document had been sitting there the whole time. Waiting. Walker had predicted everything, every move, every lie, every violation. Laura wasn't just trying to steal my land. She was walking into a federal trap and she didn't even know it. And then, as if fate couldn't help but add one more layer, my cameras caught her on my property. Again. This time, she wasn't alone. She was with contractors, pointing, measuring, directing. And then she said it clear as a bell. Caught on audio. Just get it started. We'll handle the legal issues later. She thought she was untouchable. But she wasn't. I made the calls. The sheriff, the building inspector, the county environmental officer. Claire pulled strings with a federal liaison. By 3 p.m. the next day, my cabin looked like the site of a government sting operation. Uniforms, cameras, clipboards, measuring tapes. And Laura arrived halfway through, hair perfect, posture unbending, only to realize she'd walked straight into the spotlight. Again. Clara stepped forward, cool and sharp as a scalpel. Mrs. Kent, you are currently directing unauthorized construction on federally protected land. You are in violation of conservation law. Laura's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The sheriff handed her a citation. The contractors dropped their tools like they were radioactive. The building inspector shut their job down on the spot. I stood back, watching as everything unraveled. Neighbors peeked from porches. Some stepped into the street. Tim stood silently across the lawn, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Walker's trap had been sprung, and it was glorious. But even in that moment of public disgrace, surrounded by officials, facing fines, caught on video, Laura still didn't break. She turned to me with eyes like sharpened glass and whispered, "You have no idea what you're interfering with." And maybe I didn't. Not completely. Not yet, but I knew this much. Whatever final card she thought she had, Walker had seen it coming, and he was still 2 moves ahead. She thought the worst had passed. But the thing about traps is, they're most effective when your victim believes they've already escaped. The morning after the sting, my property was still littered with broken stakes and abandoned tools. Laura had disappeared, at least publicly. No more notices, no more contractor trucks, just silence. But it wasn't peace, it was retreat. The kind you take when you're wounded and planning something worse. I knew she'd try again, and Walker knew it too. I spent hours combing through every HOA document, every archived email and newsletter I could find. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This neighborhood hadn't been run by rules. It had been run by fear. People had been fined for everything. Mailbox shape, curtain color, how many chairs sat on a porch. Bird feeders were banned, children's toys labeled as visual pollution. One woman got a violation for planting daisies instead of horror-proof marigolds. These weren't rules, they were weapons. And Laura had wielded them for years. What chilled me was how quiet the community had been about it. Like they'd all learned to live in a kind of silent agreement. Keep your head down, don't speak up, and maybe, just maybe, she'll leave you alone. I wasn't raised to stay silent. So I did what any former engineer would do when facing a system this broken. I designed an elegant way to expose it. Claire and I crafted a 30-page packet. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of them, all the residents she'd silenced and exploited. The packet contained everything: photos of her own violations, audio of her illegal contractor, meeting, permit documents tying her to her brother's construction company, the conservation easement she'd violated, and the Crown Joanne annotated timeline of harassment so detailed it read like a prosecutorial indictment. We made a copy for every household. I remember sealing the last envelope, my fingers trembling not from fear, but adrenaline, because I knew once these went out, there was no going back. The battle for my land was now a battle for truth. That night, under the cover of dusk, I slid the letters into every mailbox and waited. The first call came at 9:03 a.m., then another and another. By noon, it was chaos. Dozens of residents reached out, some angry, most shocked, and all of them finally ready to talk. Stories poured in. Mrs. Patterson fined $200 for her yellow mailbox. Mr. Rodriguez forced to dismantle his children's playground. A retired teacher cited for having too many books visible from her window. It was like uncorking a bottle of rage that had been fermenting for years. And what amazed me most, they weren't just mad at Laura. They were mad at themselves for staying silent this long. By the next evening, the community had organized an emergency meeting. Laura tried to stop it, tried to control the agenda, but for the first time in years, people ignored her. The community center was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the tile floor. Murmurs swirled like static before a thunderstorm. I stood near the back, packet in hand, watching it all unfold. Laura walked in late. No suit, no clipboard, just fury, and something else in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Desperation. "Let's bring order to this meeting," she said, her voice trembling at the edges. No one listened. Mrs. Patterson stood. She was small, elderly, and had spent years shrinking in Laura's shadow. But tonight, her voice was steady. I motioned to remove Laura Kent as HOA president for abuse of power. The room erupted. A second voice shouted. I seconded. A third, a fourth. Then came the vote. 23-1. Only Laura voted for herself. Her reign was over. She stood frozen, like someone had unplugged her power source and left her hollow. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. And then, in the silence, she broke. "You people don't understand what you're doing," she spat. "Charles Walker promised me access to that land. He said it was meant for the community. He said it would be mine." Her words hung there. Poisonous. Revealing. The entire room turned to look at me. And that's when I realized something chilling. Walker had told her something promised her something, but not what she thought. I walked to the front of the room, slow and deliberate, and placed a rolled map on the table. Laura's not wrong, I said, my voice carrying through the crowd. Charles Walker did have a plan for community development, but she completely misunderstood it. I unrolled the map. This, I said, pointing, is Lot 7B. It has full road access. No environmental restrictions. Permits were filed years ago by ironically Laura's own brother's company. They've been valid for 8 years. I paused. Until 3 days ago. Gasps rippled through the room. She spent all her energy trying to take my land-protected land when illegal development site sat right under her nose. Walker predicted it. All of it. He created the conservation easement not just to protect the land, but to distract her, to bait her. I turned to Laura. While you were busy breaking laws, you let your family's golden opportunity expire. Her knees buckled slightly. She sat down, hard, in one of the plastic chairs. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. Someone else started clapping. It spread slow, then thunderous. I should have felt triumphant. But what I felt was, Walker hadn't just won. He'd orchestrated a masterpiece of moral exposure. He hadn't destroyed her. He'd let her destroy herself. And now, with her influence gone, the board voted unanimously to reinstate fair enforcement practices, repeal my fines, and restore homeowner trust. Laura stood to leave, her shoulders rigid, her eyes vacant. As she passed me, she stopped, leaning in. She whispered something that chilled me more than any of her threats ever had. You think this is over, she said, but you still don't know what he left behind. Then she smiled, not a smirk, not a sneer, a full, airy, broken smile, and walked away. I stood there long after the room emptied out, staring at the place where she'd stood. Had Walker left one final secret? Was there more? I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't bluffing, that somewhere in the bones of this cabin, something waited. Waiting for the right time. The right person, or the right lie. And maybe the game wasn't over yet. What if the villain was telling the truth? That thought haunted me as I sat on the deck, listening to the wind stir across the water like it carried secrets. Laura's final words echoed louder than any of her threats ever had. You still don't know what he left behind. It was the kind of sentence people dismiss when they're ready to move on. But I wasn't ready. Not because I feared her, not anymore, but because I feared I didn't know everything, and I'd learned the hard way that the truth rarely screams. It whispers. I stayed up that night, replaying everything. Walker's blueprint wasn't just legal. It was psychological. He'd anticipated Laura's greed. He'd used me, this cabin, this land, all as bait to lure her into the open. But what if the final trap hadn't been for Laura? What if it was for me? I pored over the conservation easement again, trying to see it the way he would have. Every clause, every date, every phrase like code, embedded in an old computer program, elegant, exact, and waiting to execute under the right conditions. Then I found it, a name, buried deep in the original filing documents, half erased by time and ink bleed, a legal contact listed for the original submission, CW Architecture, Division E. My pulse quickened. Charles Walker hadn't filed this easement through a typical lawyer. He'd used a shell firm, a division that, as far as I could tell, didn't exist anywhere, except in other filings for projects he'd later admitted were decoys, traps, architectural morality plays, as one journalist once called them. And if this was one of those plays, then the curtain hadn't dropped yet. I dug harder. Late into the night, I scoured every article ever written about him, obscure blogs, local archives, forgotten PDF scans with grainy headlines. That's when I found the quote. An interview from 12 years ago. The reporter asked him, why hide things in buildings? Why embed messages instead of just saying what you mean? Walker's response, because honest people will find the truth when they need it. Dishonest people never think they need to look. That one line sent a chill down my back. Laura had never looked. She assumed she already owned the truth. But what if now, After all this, it was my turn to look. I returned to the cabin with a new eye. I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was looking for intention. Secrets. At first, it was subtle, an oddly placed vent, a light switch that didn't control anything, a patch of flooring under the bed that sounded hollow. I pulled up the boards. Underneath was a steel lockbox. Bolted into the subfloor, there was no keyhole, just a fingerprint, scanner, and a small recessed button beside it. My stomach dropped. This was no ordinary box. It was custom, purpose-built, and Walker was dead. I sat back, heart racing, trying to figure out what the hell I was holding. Then I remembered something. Tim had once said something about Walker spending his final year building a masterpiece. This box wasn't part of the cabin. It was the masterpiece. I tried pressing the button. Nothing. Tapping the scanner. Nothing. Dead. Unless it needed power. I traced a thin wire from the box into the wall, followed it through the crawl space until it led behind the fireplace, which made no sense until I found the switch, disguised as a loose brick. I twisted it, expecting a secret panel or drawer. Instead, the fireplace roared to life, a hidden generator. I ran back to the box and tried again. This time, the scanner lit up. Blue, waiting. I hesitated. What if it locked me out? What if I triggered something? What if I wasn't supposed to open it? But I wasn't going to let fear stop me now. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. It scanned. Beep. Then, click open. Inside was a single hard drive, old, labeled only with the words, "If she fails." I plugged it into my laptop with shaking hands. It wasn't what I expected. Not documents, not legal files. Video, hundreds of clips, dated, time-stamped. Camera footage from the cabin, some from the exterior, some from inside. Lore. Visiting while the house was vacant. Meeting contractors in secret. Even one clip of her going through Walker's mail. Months before he passed, one folder stood out. It was titled, Her Confession. I opened it. And there it was, a video file. Lore. In the cabin, standing in the living room, pacing, talking on the phone. "I don't care what he promised," she hissed. "He's dying, and once he's gone, I'll make sure we get the land. Reed doesn't know anything. He's just some tech guy. Walker's dead weight." She paused, listening. Then she said it. The sentence that made my skin crawl. "We don't need his permission. Once the HOA leans on him hard enough, he'll sell or leave. Either way, we get our access road." The date stamp. 3 weeks before I even bought the property. They'd planned this long before I got here. I was never the target. I was the delivery system. Walker had left this land with just enough bait, just enough legal gray area to draw out the truth. All he needed was someone principled enough to not fold under pressure. Someone who would do exactly what I did, not because they were brave, but because they were angry. Anger uncovers what fear hides. I sent the footage to Clara. She watched it. In stunned silence. "This," she said quietly, "is game over." We drafted a new legal brief, this time aimed at criminal charges, fraud, trespassing, conspiracy. Clara called in a contact from the county prosecutor's office. They opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. But just when I thought it was all neatly tied up, something strange happened. Laura vanished. She left no forwarding address. Her house went dark. Mail piled up. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Kent Brothers Construction filed for bankruptcy. Her name was removed from the HOA directory. She disappeared like smoke. And for a while, that was fine. The community stabilized. The board was replaced. People started smiling again. The lake felt like it used to. Quiet, safe. But one day, a package arrived at my door. No return address. No stamp. Inside was a single object, a USB drive. No note, no explanation. Just the drive. I stared at it for a long time before plugging it into a clean, offline laptop. It contained only one file, a photo of me, taken from the woods, grainy, distant, but unmistakably recent. Suddenly the cabin didn't feel so safe anymore. Had she been watching me, waiting? Or was this someone else entirely? Maybe Laura wasn't the final player. Maybe she was just the first to fold. As the screen faded to black, I found myself whispering the question Walker had likely asked himself once before. What happens when the trap outlives the prey? Sometimes victory feels like a question you're afraid to ask. I stood at the edge of the lake, the breeze brushing my cheek like a hand I didn't trust. The water rippled gently. Everything looked still normal, but I wasn't, because once you've opened a locked box and found evidence of conspiracy, criminal intent, and carefully calculated revenge, you stop trusting quiet moments. You start looking over your shoulder, even when you're alone. Especially when you're alone. That USB drive haunted me. The photo was grainy, sure, but it was recent. It wasn't a snapshot from months ago, not something left over from a surveillance campaign long dead. The trees had summer leaves. My clothes, I'd worn them just last week. Whoever took the photo had been near me recently, and they delivered it directly to my door. Which meant two things. One, someone wanted me to know I was being watched. Two, they weren't finished. At first, I told myself it was paranoia. Maybe it was old. Maybe Laura had left it behind. A last-ditch scare tactic before disappearing. But something didn't sit right. I checked my cameras. No movement, no motion alerts, no vehicles on the road. Whoever delivered it had either found a blind spot, or they knew how to move without being seen, which meant this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I called Claire. Her voice was sharp as ever, but she didn't waste time pretending this was normal. This wasn't Laura, she said after a long pause. She's gone. Bank records show she liquidated her accounts and vanished. The bankruptcy filing for Kent Brothers was real, but this feels personal. I didn't want it to be personal. I wanted to go back to watching the lake and listening to birds and sipping coffee without wondering who might be in the woods with a cane. Raw, but Walker's masterpiece had drawn blood, and blood attracts attention. Claire and I went back to the permit records, rechecked ownership filings, looked for names that had previously been buried behind shell companies. And that's when we found something, a signature, not Laura's, or different Kent. Adam Kent, her brother, the same man who'd filed the development permits years ago, the one whose company needed access to my land. His name had always been background noise in this story, the quiet financial partner, the man behind the blueprints. But now, his signature had appeared on a new document, a corporate filing made just 6 weeks ago, this time under a different LLC, registered out of state, different name. Same address. And same development plan. Access road still pointed straight through my cabin's waterfront. They weren't done. Laura had taken the fall. But Adam, he was still trying to build the resort. He'd just changed the mask. I felt a cold dread curl around my spine. This wasn't a rogue HOA president anymore. This was a family operation. And now the gloves were off. That same night, I noticed my cameras glitched out just for a second. A flicker, static, a hard reset. It happened again the next day, and the next. That's when I realized this wasn't just someone watching me. They were testing my defenses. I doubled my security, replaced all cameras, hardwired motion sensors, installed backup batteries and solar redundancy. The cabin turned into a fortress, not out of fear, but calculation. Because if they were coming, I wanted to see it. And still, I hoped I was wrong. Until the sheriff knocked on my door. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. His cruiser crunched up the gravel, slow and deliberate. He didn't step out right away. When he did, he looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Reed," he said, tugging at his belt, "we've received a complaint." Multiple complaints, actually, about unapproved surveillance equipment. HOA regulations still apply. And I stopped him right there. "Who made the complaints?" I asked. He shifted. "Anonymous." Of course. Clara had warned me they'd try to use the HOA again. Not through Laura this time, but through procedural loopholes. false reports, weaponized bylaws. I have federal documentation of criminal trespass. I said calmly, I have video, property rights, and evidence of attempted fraud. You want to challenge my right to protect my property? The deputy paused, then exhaled. No, sir, I don't. He left quietly. But I could feel it, the walls closing again, not through brute force, through paperwork, noise, harassment. The same game, different player. That night, I stood in the kitchen staring at the hard drive Walker left me. I hadn't opened every file. There were still folders I hadn't explored, either because I hadn't wanted to, or because I'd been too focused on the immediate threats. But now, I needed answers. One folder was labeled, for him. Inside were documents, not legal ones, personal ones, letters, emails, photos. It was like Walker had written a private journal of everything he knew about Laura, Adam, and the entire Kemp family. It went back years, receipts, internal memos, screenshots of texts between developers planning under-the-table deals, and in one audio file, Walker himself, speaking directly to the microphone. If you're listening to this, his voice said, rough and tired. Then the trap worked. She took the bait. But her brother, he's the real wolf. She's just the teeth. He's the mind. He coughed. It was wet, sharp, the kind of cough that comes near the end. I needed someone who wouldn't fold. Someone who knew systems, knew how to fight clean, but hard. That's you, Reed. That's why I picked you. This cabin, it's yours. It's always been yours. But the story, that's mine. And now, it's yours too. I sat in silence for a long time after that, because I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Walker hadn't just chosen me to finish what he started. He'd chosen me to survive it. And now, I wasn't just defending a cabin, I was defending a legacy. That week, Claire and I filed a formal legal motion, citing harassment, attempted land seizure, and newly uncovered evidence of coordinated developer fraud. The motion named Adam Kent directly. We served it through the county courthouse. 2 days later, I received a letter in return. No envelope. No postage. Just a single type sheet. Taped to my front door in the middle of the night. It read, Walker's game is over, but yours is just beginning. No signature. No threats. Just a reminder that I wasn't dealing with amateurs anymore. I was dealing with people who believed the land was theirs, no matter what the law said. And they weren't afraid to start the war all over again. I looked out across the lake that night, the moon rippling across the water like it was trying to write warnings in light. But the message was already clear. This wasn't about property anymore. This was about principle. About whether legacy could be stolen, or if it could fight back. Because maybe Walker had one more masterpiece still unfolding, and maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the end of his plan. I was the beginning. How do you fight someone who doesn't need to win, just needs you to lose? I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying that line from the anonymous letter. Walker's game is over, but yours is just beginning, like it was a baton passed. In the dark, a warning, or maybe a challenge. For a moment, I stared at the front door, wondering if someone had stood there watching me sleep, if they timed the delivery perfectly, knowing I'd find it right before sunrise. The idea made my skin crawl, not just the invasion, but the certainty. They weren't guessing anymore, they were watching. Claire didn't waste time when I called. They're baiting you, she said, trying to provoke a mistake, but they don't know who they're dealing with. You're not a retiree they can't intimidate. You're a data engineer with a paper trail so thick they'd need a match and a miracle to erase it. I wanted to believe that. But what if they didn't plan to erase anything? What if they planned to bury me in it? The next HOA meeting wasn't hosted by Laura anymore. She was gone, remembered mostly in whispered jokes and relieved expressions. But the atmosphere hadn't relaxed. If anything, it felt tenser. Because we all knew the battle had just moved underground. The new president, a former board member named Eleanor, called the meeting to order with all the enthusiasm of someone forced to host a funeral for a still-breathing corpse. She kept glancing at the back of the room, where a tall, gray-haired man stood silently, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I recognized him from a photo in Walker's archive. Adam Kent. He hadn't said a word publicly since Laura's fall, but his presence was louder than any speech. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was scouting, watching me, testing how far he'd have to push before I broke. That evening, a black SUV rolled slowly past my cabin, not fast, not subtle, just deliberate, like it wanted me to see it, to lapse around the property. No plates, no headlights. Then it vanished. The next day, my mailbox was ripped off the post and thrown into the woods. A week later, someone filed a building code complaint against my generator, claiming it was emitting unauthorized noise levels. Code violation, possible fine, pending inspection. But we both knew what it really was. Pressure. Tightening. I was being stalked by paper cuts. And somewhere behind it all, Adam Kent was pulling strings, legal ones, procedural ones, even social ones. Clara discovered a series of anonymous online posts trashing me on local forums, calling me a toxic neighbor, an entitled outsider, even implying I had inherited the cabin through suspicious means. Character assassination by proxy. The timing wasn't subtle. He was laying the groundwork for the next phase, but Walker had left me with something far better than a hard drive and legal forms. He'd left me with a strategy, not just defense, disruption. And now, it was my turn. I started digging, not into permits this time, into people. Adam Kent had kept his name out of most public documents, but he wasn't invisible. Clara found a trail, small business litigation from 10 years ago, failed partnerships, a whisper of bribery allegations in a resort project that never broke ground. He'd walked away clean every time, sure, but the pattern was unmistakable. Adam Kent was a man who didn't build unless he could bulldoze, which meant he didn't just want my land, he wanted every voice that opposed him to go silent. And that's when I found it. A file buried deep in Walker's drive, mislabeled. Almost like he didn't want anyone finding it too easily. Echo 17. Inside, a complete architectural plan for the Kent Resort project. Full renderings, infrastructure plans, access roads, utility blueprints. But something was off. Walker had drawn these. Not Adam's firm. These weren't development plans. They were sabotage. Because embedded inside the document was a clause, a fabricated utility easement, claiming access to my waterfront had already been granted, signed by a name that didn't exist. It was a fake, a baited document, designed to tempt Adam into submitting it as evidence, knowing full well that doing so would constitute fraud. Walker had left behind the perfect trap, one final mousetrap with cheese so tempting, so nearly legal, that Adam would bite. And when he did, it wouldn't be civil anymore. It would be criminal. Clara reviewed the files 3 times before speaking. He left this for you to deploy when the time was right. It's not forged. It's traceable. It has digital fingerprints only Walker could have created. If Adam files this, we've got him. I paused. So how do we make him use it? She smiled. We leak it. That week, we sent an anonymous packet to Kent Brothers' newly formed out-of-state shell company, now operating as Blue Shore Development. Inside was the document. No signature, no explanation. Just a note that read, a gift from the past. This will give you what you want. It worked. 3 weeks later, Adam submitted a revised permit application, this time to the state. The same forged utility clause embedded in his supporting documents, and we were watching every signature, every submission, every digital TIMESTAMP. We sent the evidence, all of it, to the district attorney. And waited. The morning the indictment dropped, I was standing on my dock. I hadn't slept much the night before. My eyes felt sanded raw. My hands curled instinctively into fists. When I saw the unmarked car pull into the neighborhood. Clara texted one word. Filed. Fraud. attempted land seizure, perjury, filing falsified documents with a government agency. They arrested him at his office. The news hit like a detonation. Neighbors watched from their driveways. People whispered his name like it was a ghost. No one had seen Adam Kent go down before, but now they'd seen it with their own eyes. Cuffed, hauled out of a glass building he designed to impress, eyes down, mouth shut. It should have felt like victory, but all I felt was exhaustion. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a reckoning. That night, I poured myself a whiskey, sat on the porch, and opened the last folder Walker left on the drive. It wasn't a document. It wasn't a video. It was a letter. Not typed, scanned, in Walker's handwriting, shaky, but unmistakable. Oliver, I knew this land would become a battlefield. People like Laura and Adam don't understand beauty unless they can charge admission for it. I couldn't stop them, but I could give them a puzzle they couldn't solve, and I could find someone honest enough, stubborn enough, to hold the line. You didn't inherit my war. You finished it. Now to something I never could. Make this place whole again. I stared at that final sentence for a long time, because I understood what he meant. The trap was over, the war was won, but the damage, that was mine to fix. The hardest part of any war isn't the fight. It's what comes after. Once the shouting stops, once the enemies vanish, once the cameras are gone and the adrenaline wears off, what's left? Silence. And a lot of broken things. For the first few days after Adam Kent's arrest, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. No gossip, no lawnmowers, no kids playing. It was like everyone had collectively held their breath, too stunned to exhale. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some lawyer to show up with another technicality, for some hidden clause to reopen the door. But nothing came, just bills. And quiet. But the quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like recovery. Tim was the first to come by. He didn't knock, just wandered over with a folding chair and a thermos, sat it down beside me on the deck like we were picking up a conversation mid-sentence, even though neither of us said a word for at least 10 minutes. Then, softly, he'd be proud, you know? I didn't answer, because pride felt too small. For what this wasn't a win. Not really. It was a prevention, a holding pattern, a delayed disaster. But then Tim added, you gave people something they didn't think they had anymore. What's that? Permission to fight. It caught me off guard. That word. Permission. I hadn't thought about it like that. But maybe that was all it had ever been. A community slowly boiled until no one remembered what cold water felt like. People didn't need heroes. They just needed someone to stand up first. Someone to show it was allowed. Still, the wreckage was real. Laura had vanished. Adam was indicted. Kent brothers had collapsed. But their shadow remained. I walked the property line every morning. A ritual. No, not because I expected anyone to be there, but because I needed to reclaim it, foot by foot, thought by thought. The lake looked different, not worse. Just older, like it had seen too much. I found a red surveyor's flag tangled in a bush one morning, probably left behind by one of Adam's contractors. It flapped in the wind like a tiny white flag dipped in blood. I didn't throw it away. I nailed it to the inside wall of the shed, a reminder, not of defeat, but of what almost happened. A week later, Eleanor from the HOA called me. She asked if I would speak at the next meeting. People need to understand what really happened, she said. They've heard rumors, read articles, but they don't know the full story. I wasn't sure if I was ready to share it. Not publicly, not in front of the same people who once ignored Laura's rulebook or watched me collect violation notices without lifting a finger. But Walker's letter echoed in my head. Now do something I never could. Make this place whole again. I went. The room was full, not just the board, but families, elderly couples, teens, new residents, old ones, people who'd once stayed quiet, now looking at me with something fragile in their eyes. Hope, maybe, or guilt, or both. I didn't use slides. Didn't bring a binder. I just told the story. Straight, clean. No dramatics. How Walker had baited lore. How Adam had tried to build an empire with someone else's land. How the HOA had been used, weaponized, against its own people. And then I showed them the footage, the confession, the forged documents, the architectural trap, gasps, whispers. One woman covered her mouth and started crying when I showed the survey map with the fake utility clause. But it wasn't outrage I saw on their faces. It was relief. They weren't crazy. The weird fines, the arbitrary rules, the whispered threats. It had all been real. And now, finally, someone had put it into words. I finished the story with a single sentence. Walker didn't save this community. He handed us the chance to save ourselves. The applause didn't come all at once. It rolled like a wave, hesitant, then swelling. Eleanor stood and said what no one had dared say before. I moved to dissolve the current HOA charter and rebuild it under new oversight, with full transparency. The vote passed unanimously. And just like that, the neighborhood turned a page. But Peter's leave fingerprints. The next morning, I got a letter from a neighbor I barely knew, handwritten, folded neatly. It said, I wanted to leave this place for years. My kids hated living here. The fear was subtle, the kind you can't quite describe. But watching what you did, how you stood up, how you never backed down, it made me believe we could stay, that this could be home again. Thank you. It hit harder than any legal victory, because that's what the fight was really about. Not land. Not power. Not even Walker's legacy. It was about belonging. That afternoon, I met with Clara one last time. Her office felt different now, less like a war room, more like the final scene of a movie where the dust settles and the hero walks out with their wounds stitched up. You're free, she said, handing me the final resolution. All liens removed. No pending litigation. The easement remains. The cabin is yours. Untouchable. You did it. I shook her hand. She didn't let go right away. Most people would have settled, kept, moved, but you stayed. You held the line. I smelled. I didn't do it alone. Clara nodded. Neither did Walker. Later that evening, I found a small envelope in the attic. One I hadn't noticed before, taped beneath a floorboard under the loft. Inside was a note. Just for words. In Walker's handwriting. Check the weather vane. It was mounted high on the roof, an old copper piece shaped like a fish. Rusted from rain and years of neglect, I climbed up carefully, unscrewed the base. Inside, a key. And beneath it, a flash drive. I plugged it into the laptop with the same reverence I'd given the others. Just one file, a video. Walker again, this time younger, healthier, smiling, Oliver. He said, if you're seeing this, you made it. You did what I hoped someone would have the guts to do. He looked away from the camera for a moment, then back. This place, this cabin, it's more than a home. It's a promise. That power doesn't get the last word. That tyranny eventually eats itself. That truth always leaves a trail. If someone's willing to follow it. He paused. His smile faded into something quieter, deeper. Make this place into what it was always meant to be. A community. The screen faded to black, and I just sat there. Staring at my own reflection. Because I understood now. Walker hadn't just trapped the greedy. He'd recruited the brave. And now, it was time to stop surviving. It was time to build. I thought the lake was quiet before, but this silence, it was different. It wasn't the stillness of nature or the hush before a storm. It was the sound of something old finally exhaling, like the land itself had been holding its breath for years, and now it could finally breathe. The HOA had been restructured. Lore was a ghost no one mentioned by name. Adam was under investigation, fighting an uphill legal war with dwindling funds and a reputation scorched beyond repair, and the community, it had changed. Front yards bloomed with color again, not the approved hues, but the ones people actually liked. Lawn chairs returned, bird feeders reappeared. Porch wind chimes danced on breezes that no longer carried the fear of fines. But Despite the quiet, I didn't feel peace. Not entirely. Because peace implies an ending. And this didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. A single breath before whatever comes next. There was still the photo. The one left anonymously on my doorstep weeks ago. A picture of me. Taken from the woods. And there was still the mystery of how Laura had disappeared so cleanly. No trace. No forwarding address. No credit card activity. No posts. No slips. Clara had a theory. Witness protection. Maybe. Or a backroom deal to avoid criminal charges in exchange for a permanent exit. But I wasn't convinced. The day after the new HOA charter was ratified, I received a package in the mail. No sender. No return address. But this time, it wasn't a USB drive. It was a book. Hardcover. Old. Faded title nearly rubbed off the spine. The Architecture of Authority. Inside was a single bookmark, a pressed maple leaf, and a handwritten message on the title page. He taught you how to fight shadows. But do you know how to live in the light? No name. No signature. Just another riddle. Another seed. I turned the book over and over, looking for some clue, some signature, some code. Nothing. Until I noticed the call number faintly stamped inside the back cover. It belonged to a university. Walker's alma mater. I made the drive that weekend, not because I expected answers. I'd stopped expecting those. But because I needed closure. What I found there unraveled everything. The library archivist, a kind-eyed woman named Marie, recognized Walker's name immediately. He used to send us copies of his private lectures. She said, mostly theory, some schematics, ethical philosophy and architecture. He called them his architectural sermons. She led me to a locked filing cabinet, bottom drawer, dusty, unlabeled. Inside were 4 manila folders. One of them had my name on it. Read. Oliver face for I open it slowly. Hands trembling. Inside were floor plans for the cabin. My cabin, annotated in Walker's handwriting. He'd labeled rooms not by function, not bedroom, kitchen, porch, but by emotion. Clara stands in at the center, the living room. A single word, inheritance. Taped to the back of the final page was a note. You don't own this place. You continue it. Every story needs a final scene. But not every story ends. I walked out of the library feeling like I'd just reader will address to my soul. Because I finally understood. Walker hadn't just built a trap for tyrants. He'd built a vessel. For ideas, for courage, for memory. And he'd chosen me to be its next architect. The cabin wasn't a reward. It was an assignment. The question was, what now? I drove home slow that night. Headlights carving through fog like a scalpel. Through flesh, the trees swayed, the road curled, and I couldn't help but feel like I was moving towards something final. Back at the cabin, I poured a drink. Stood on the deck, watched the lake. And waited. I don't know why I expected something to happen. A knock, a shadow, a sound, but nothing came. Only stars, only wind, only silence. And maybe that was the final trick Walker left me. To show that not all answers come wrapped in confrontation. Sometimes they come in absence. 3 days later, I received word that Adam had taken a plea deal. No jail time, but a lifetime ban on holding positions of development authority, a substantial fine, and full surrender of all Kent Brothers assets tied to the Willow Lake project. It was over. Officially. Undeniably. Over. And yet, a part of me still watches the tree line each morning. A part of me still checks the camera feeds at night. Not because I expect danger, but because I know what greed looks like when it thinks no one's watching. Walker knew it, too, which is why he didn't just build defenses, he built reminders. And so I left the red flag hanging inside the shed. I kept the violation notices Laura once plastered to my door, framed, now, behind glass, not as trophies, but as warnings, symbols of what happens when people mistake authority for righteousness. The new HOA board asked if I'd consider surveying. I declined, but I gave them something else. A box of every document, video, and architectural trap walker ever created. They call it the Read Archive. I told them to share it with every new board member, every new homeowner. Every person who thinks they understand what community really means. Because the truth is simple: community and controlled audits, accountability. And remembering that takes constant work. Weeks passed, then months. The lake thawed, children returned to their yards, laughter echoed again. I started sleeping through the night. Even the nightmares faded. Then one morning, while cleaning out the attic, I found one last sealed envelope. My name, scrawled in thick black ink. No stamp. No return address. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single line, a whisper, a promise. This is not the last time you'll be tested. I stared at the words for a long time. They weren't a threat. They were a truth. Because legacy doesn't end when the enemy falls. It ends when no one remembers why the fight mattered in the first place. And I wasn't about to let that happen. So I walk the shoreline every week. I wave to my neighbors. I listen for wind chimes. I tend the garden. Not out of fear, not out of pride, but because the land deserves a steward, not a soldier. And somewhere, maybe in the wind, maybe in the bones of this old cabin, I still feel Walker watching, not judging. Just making sure I remember. What we fought for, what we lost, what we protected, and what still needs protecting. Sometimes, when the moon hits the lake just right, and the pines whisper louder than the wind, I swear I can hear him. Laughing. Knowing. That the masterpiece wasn't the cabin. It wasn't the trap. It wasn't the full of a tyrant. It was me. And what I chose to become when the storm ended. And if you've made it this far, tell me something. Would you have stayed? Would you have fought? Or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments. Because in HOA stories, the war is never just about property. It's about the people who dare to fight back, and the shadows that don't go down without leaving one last scar. Stick around, we've got receipts.